This is Tyler O'Neill. I'm honored to be joined by Forrest Smith. I heard briefly your story. What I loved most about what you said was that this echoes, this movement of transgender identity, ideology, echoes what we saw in the Roman Empire with the cult of Cybele. And that's a connection I hadn't heard. I've heard the Gnostic connection a lot, which I also think is strong. But what really opened your eyes to this, and what message does that have for our culture today?
This is something that they talked about in the trans community. So I learned about this because it was a piece of rhetoric within my former community that trans people have always existed.
Yeah.
Now, after what happened to me, I had a bilateral orchiectomy and came to regret it. I wanted to revisit that out of curiosity, and I found a poem called Catullus, number 63.
Yeah.
And that actually is the story of Attis, who castrates himself for a goddess. But this was the Roman perception of a cult that had already existed for several hundred years. And the Romans brought a new perspective. He imagined this young man who was actually dressing up as the goddess before he castrates himself. And Catullus imagines him regretting it. And it's beautifully written. And of course I resonated with it. This wasn't just a wild imagination. This was somebody who was watching a public spectacle of men cross-dressing and castrating themselves. It was very, very similar to what we have going on now, and that speaks to something that is a universal human error. Okay, because it's not something that it's not a continual line in history. Marriage is a continual line. You have to have a man and a woman get together and have a family in order for a society to exist, and in order for us to pass on knowledge, you need family and society. That's continual. But this other phenomenon is not. And so that becomes a very interesting question of what is it that happens in society and civilization for this to come about. And then the more you read, the more you know the name of this goddess. You know that this goddess is also the Magna Mater, the mother of mountains, the great mother. You know that this goddess comes from Phrygia. You put all these together and you get a very clear picture that was the subject of so much commentary. In fact, there was a cultural war. It was a bit of a culture war in the ancient world, just like we have now. And the parallels are very striking.
Well, they were very pluralistic in ancient Rome, like they were in ancient Athens.
Yes.
With the unknown god.
Yes. And so in actually Euripides, the Bacchae tells the story of Bacchus coming, and Bacchus is associated with Cybele and with those same cults, and the young man is feminized and then dismembered at the end. And that was part of this commentary, and the Greek commentary and the Roman commentary, which I think was right. They were looking at where it came from, which was this, the story of King Midas comes from this corner of Turkey where this cult came from, because they were so wealthy, and they were an ancient civilization. It was an ancient civilization that was on the decline. And so the saying, I think it was Strabo who said, it's not the water or the air that is making these men effeminate. It's the wealth. It's the riches. And that's the story. You see, when a civilization gets to a certain point, this disease kind of jumps into its head, and that's an interesting question, and that's why when you look at this, it's big.
Do we need poverty to fix it?
No, and that's part of why I would. You have to ask yourself, are you better off living in a time when this is going on? Are you better off living in a time that's really, really hard and poor? So it comes down to the individual, the way I see it. The way individuals and communities, subcultures that choose to remember this and to learn from this lesson and not to make this mistake. And very wise policy needs to be crafted and maintained, but also protecting our right to religion, our right to freedom of religion, and our right to free speech, the right of physicians who are willing to not medicalize, right? Those are the rights we need to protect primarily, because the most dangerous thing that's going on is that this cult is trying to suppress those rights. That's the worst part about this, because how far can we suppress this while honoring the Constitution, while honoring the right to freedom, pursuit of happiness? All of those are valid, while honoring states' rights. Those are all valid. That's, for me, those are the most valid arguments against this, or for it. Now, the most valid arguments against this is simply that it's not science. It's the medical aspect. And if you go back to what changed in Rome, so there's two things. This is where it gets a little dark. The Christianization of Rome, a theological advancement. The Trinity is theologically advanced. That was a big advance in our understanding of God and divinity.
It's hard for us to understand.
It is, unless you unless you really spend time thinking about belief and religion. And that shut down a cult that had been petering out. That shut down a cult that was already on the decline. And if you go back, you can read, actually, St. Augustine has so many polemics against this cult. St. Justin Martyr has polemics against this cult. You'll find the early church addressed this. There's very strong prohibition on castration. We live continentally, is what St. Justin Martyr said. So this was tackled by the early church. But you also see the collapse of the Roman Empire, and you see a vast, Europe go into the Dark Ages and a feudal way of life. So it's not quite comparable. The question, you have both things. You have an advanced understanding of theology. You do have a collapse, and we don't want to bring about a collapse, but now we don't live in quite the same world of belief and religion. We have our medical, there's many thinkers have come before me. Thomas Sachs described the pharmacracy. As we no longer have a theocracy, we have a pharmacracy, and he actually points to the Nazi regime as being this kind of first example of an attempt at pharmacracy.
Well, so much of our medical advancements came, unfortunately, through the horrific experiments they conducted.
And this science came out of Berlin. It came out of the German Empire, the Second German Empire, and I think there's reasons for that. If you look at some of the law, like the strange laws, the strange, lopsided, very repressive, not like a lot of Western Europe that was a little bit more like homosexuality is not the business of the state. In the German Empire, the Prussian Penal Code said no, that's punishable by prison time, but there were no laws against quackery. They had something called, it was in German, I forget the name, but freedom to cure. It was very intentional. They wanted to have the best science in medicine. They were very ambitious medically. So there were no laws on, it's not that there were no laws, it's that you didn't have to be a doctor to practice medicine. There was very laissez-faire. So you see, what I'm saying is it was lopsided. There was a repression on your social freedom. And at the same time, you can do whatever you want in medicine. And so what came out was these experiments came out of Magnus Hirschfeld, a man who was a gay man and a cross-dresser, trying to find a way to prove that homosexuality was natural. The German Penal Code said it was unnatural. And so he begins actually surgically operating, castrating people. Now this is my take, but this is where it's true. This is where the first surgeries come from. Is this particular cultural moment? And you can ask, was it bound to happen? But that's where we see this begin in modern history. And they knew what they were doing. Hirschfeld and Benjamin, they knew what they were doing. They would take pictures of sleeping hermaphroditus, those statues from the ancient Roman Empire, and say, look, it's always been going on. So I do find the history interesting. You can tell that I've read a lot about it.
Yeah. What do you think of, we heard this term misandry, which I think is a very good term. Our culture demonizes a lot of the traditional aspects of masculinity. And I think one of the things that's contributing to transitions, like, I don't know what your particular story was, but some men deciding to identify as women could be driven by this, demonization of typically masculine traits.
I think that's a part of it. But even that is part of something bigger. So, the question is kind of like what came first? Did feminism come first, or was there a fault in masculinity that came first? Did we get tired of fighting? Did a hole appear in the place where there should be a father? Did we lose that role of father simply because of men tiring out? Was there just an epidemic of masculine exhaustion before we see some of this I was going to say feminism, but I believe it's very complex. I can speak personally. I certainly know that, yes, in the, like, for me, in the 2000s, the early 2000s and the 2010s, learning how to be a man and knowing what was appropriate for me, having a kind of broken relationship with my father, and knowing that he had a broken relationship with his father before him, had a vacuum, and the culture certainly made transition more appealing. And the reason I hesitate around this is because I know that there's a lot of women who would say the opposite, and they might point to pornography as misogynistic. Now, so it's all very, very complex, right?
Yeah, very much so. Well, thank you so much again for speaking with me.